the way I look at the world is through game theory. And for me, what's really important is how nations have behaved in the past. So when you say the Middle Kingdom, from a Chinese perspective, just means that we don't care about the rest of the world. We've never really cared about the rest of the world. All we care about is the internal stability of China, because historically, and this is very important, is that China has been poor and corrupt. And so rebellions against the government are very commonplace. And so your entire state apparatus is structured to ensure that local rebellions don't arise. And in the 1980s, there was a solution to this problem of local rebellions when basically the communist system had an agreement where we will engage in economic reform and we will allow the elite to engage in corruption, okay? And so that incentivized the elite to promote economic reform and turn away from the old socialist model of Mao Zedong. And in the 1980s, this was very controversial. But because of the financial incentives, the elite engage in market reform. But then you have a tremendous corruption problem. Also, where was this money going, right? They were engaging in this corruption. They weren't putting it in China because it was not safe, because they were stealing this from the government, right? So this was being transferred overseas to America, to Canada. And look, I mean, like, I don't want to go into specifics, but I will tell you, like, the amount of capital that was being transferred overseas was just tremendous, okay? So much so that really the Chinese economy is now suffering under a deflationary spiral, okay? But it was not just capital that went overseas, it was also the elite that went overseas, right? The children, the families of the elite, all are now overseas. And I don't want to go into specifics, but you know, if they are overseas, where are their national interests aligned, right? They want peace and harmony between China and America because they see China as a plantation economy where they can continue to exploit the economy and then take their ill-gotten gains and then take it over to the Western joy or Western lifestyle, okay? And for many decades, this was just the way business was done in China. And it worked to the tremendous benefit of the Chinese elite as well as the Western economies. And then when President Xi came to power, he recognized that this is not sustainable in the long term. Eventually, our economy is going to collapse. Eventually, we're going to have rebellions all over the place. And so he started to clamp down on corruption, and he started to focus on national rejuvenation, on creating a national identity. And from his perspective, the way you do that is through unifying with Taiwan and establishing an independent economic system that is based on the Chinese yuan as opposed to the US dollar. So that was his intention. But again, the reality is that China is a very corrupt place, and so the elite are rebelling against him. And so these past 2 years, and this is public information, most of the generals in the military have been purged for corruption issues, for other issues as well. Meaning, like, the military does not have the political will to engage in a foreign conflict anywhere. So yes, I understand there's the intention of the state, but then there's the cultural reality in which we live in. If this makes any sense. Sorry.
Makes a tremendous amount of sense. It is the kind of thing that explains your absolute meteoric rise. This is a very, very useful conversation. I'm very grateful. Okay, so that's a very clear picture of China that is very different, I think, than the common person in America would view it as. I'm going to put that back on the shelf. Let it sort of sit in the background as we get back to Iran and look at what I want to talk about is we've got those two things. So we've got China's, the realities of everything. We've got US empire acting the way that failing empires do. They're flailing, they're acting like bullies, they're overextending, they're getting themselves in trouble, doing anything that they can to hold on to the vestiges of their empire. A thesis that you've put forward that I find very compelling is that the current world order, the post-World War II order, the monolithic US as global hegemon, those world orders are done. They're already dead. And maybe you're watching the death throes or whatever, but the new world order is coming. And I want to understand, what does the new world order look like? And as with Iran as pivot point, what does it look like? How does this play out? How deep do we go? And why is there no sort of ability to preserve the current world order?
First of all, the current global economic order is based on the premise of cheap oil, right? Because cheap oil is the basis for everything. Like from the Strait of Hormuz, you don't just have energy, you also have fertilizer, which allows you to grow food. You also have sulfuric acid, which is what allows you to process semiconductors. Okay, so cheap oil, cheap energy is the basis for the entire global economy. The reality is the Strait of Hormuz is not going to open tomorrow. It's probably going to stay closed for the next few years, meaning like the world loses access to cheap oil. Okay, so we need to think ahead and see what this means for the rest of the world. And so I would say there are three major trends that we should expect in the next 4 to 5 years. All right, and I think these trends will be very, very salient. So the first major trend is deindustrialization and deurbanization, meaning that it doesn't really make sense to have millions of people live in cities doing digital work. Why? Because the economy is not balanced. You need people to grow food, and then you need manufacturing as well. Before, you didn't have to worry about this because it was a globalized economy where you can import food, all right? And like, just think about how, if you're a middle-class American, you basically have a higher standard of living than the Roman emperor, because you could, every day go to the supermarket and eat avocados, cherries. You can have food from all around the world all the time. And again, this is because of access to cheap oil. But those days are gone. And basically, like, economies need to become a much more balanced economy. And that means moving people from the cities, especially young people, and moving them back to the rural areas so that they can grow food and be self-sufficient, okay? So that's gonna be trend number one. Trend number two is, like, before, globalization was the religion, was the faith of the times. But now that globalization is collapsing because American power can no longer support globalization, nations need to reassert themselves, okay? So you have the rise of nationalism, which then allows for remilitarization in order to protect their borders better, right? Because before, you could just rely on American military power for protection. But now you have to defend yourself, right? And you do that through rejuvenating people's sense of national pride and identity, okay? So nationalism, remilitarization is the second big trend. The third big trend is mercantilism, okay? Basically self-sufficient economic spheres around the world. And it's gonna look differently in different places, where Europe might be a trading bloc unto itself, but in other places, maybe Israel, maybe Japan, create their own economic zones through military power, right? And then in the Northern Hemisphere, I think that America will come out okay, because really, I mean, like America is a superpower regardless, right? So America retreats from the rest of the world, but then it builds an economic system within the Western Hemisphere, and then it's fine. So we're seeing a rupture or splintering of the world, and going back basically to the 1930s.
That's wild. Okay, so who are going to be the winners and who are going to be the losers in this?
Right. So basically, whichever nation is most able to embrace these trends and transform their economies from one that is globally dependent to much more nationally dependent will survive. Okay. So that's why I think that Japan in Asia is actually better positioned than China, because the Chinese economy is too export orientated. Okay, the Chinese economy just relies on dumping cheap goods onto the global market, and you can do that again with cheap oil and a global marketplace. But once nations start to go into war, and then they can no longer trade, then China is forced to become much more insular. And unfortunately, the Chinese economy is not balanced, meaning like it's completely dependent on exports, and consumers don't actually have any demand because consumers don't have any capital. They don't have any savings to spend money on. Consumers are afraid of the future. They lack confidence. Okay, so China is in a very tough situation because the Chinese economy and Chinese planners are not able to make the transition from one that is a global economy to one that is a much more regional economy. Okay, Japan, on the other hand, has a history and a record of making radical transformations when the existence of the nation is at stake. Okay, so you just look at Japan, and you think, oh my God, Japan is completely screwed because they have an aging crisis, because they are completely dependent on resources from abroad. They don't actually have their own oil, and the Japanese economy, it has been in a deflationary spiral for the past 20, 30 years. Okay, you think Japan is completely screwed, but when all hope seems lost, the Japanese somehow come together and then transform their entire system. Okay, and so this goes. So I'll give you a few examples where, you know, in the 1200s or 1300s, when the Mongolians were coming to invade Japan, and Japan at this time was, you know, like feudal system. They came together as a people, and we opposed the Mongolian invasion not once but twice. Okay, that's very impressive. Then they go to the Meiji Reformation, right, which is the mid-19th century, when China had already been carved up by the Western powers, and Japan's like, okay, we need to industrialize now, and they did so in 20 years. All right,
Wow.
so much so that Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. And then you go to the end of World War II, when the Japanese economy was completely devastated. So what happened? The Japanese people came together, and in 20 years' time, they became the world's dominant manufacturing power. Okay, the Japanese are a special people. Never ever bet against the Japanese. So even though the things look darkest for the Japanese, they are remarkably resilient people and cohesive people. So I think like they are the most likely to make the transformations necessary in order to survive the new global order. Another thing I will say is the aging crisis, where every industrial economy is suffering from the aging crisis, right? You have people living into the 90s, into the hundreds, and they're not working when they are just consuming a lot of resources. And every industrial nation is going to suffer from this issue. But the Japanese are different, meaning like if the Japanese nation is under stress and there's a crisis, and the elderly in Japan need to make the necessary sacrifices in order for their grandchildren to survive, they will do so. And no other nation in the world will do this, okay? Get the baby boomers in America to make sacrifices for America. I mean, you can make an argument like a lot of the issues in America come from the fact that the baby boomers are a selfish, materialistic, and self-absorbed generation that refuse to surrender power, right? I mean, like look at how old their Congress is. You've got this guy Chuck Grassley. How old is he? Like 94 or something? He's still there. What is he doing?
Yeah, it is. I have to admit, it is pretty wild.
Soft, contemplative music begins. Low, atmospheric, with a sense of weight. It plays for a long moment before fading into the background, leaving only the sound of a quiet, measured breath. Okay, I need to take a moment before I even begin this, because what I've just watched, it's not the kind of thing you click on lightly. The title is Prof Jiang on the Mind of Xi Jinping, and I want to be very careful how I approach this. Not because I'm afraid, but because what I've just witnessed is something that requires a certain kind of attention, a certain kind of reverence even. Because when you hear a title like that, depending on where you are in the world, you might expect one of several things. You might expect a political analysis. You might expect a critique. You might expect a piece of propaganda, or its opposite. But what I actually watched, it was none of those things. Or rather, it was all of those things, but transformed into something else entirely. Let me set the scene, because context is everything here. This is not a slick produced video. It's not a press conference. It's not a rally. It's an academic setting, or at least it feels like one. There's a professor. The title says Professor Jiang, and she is speaking. And from the very first moment, you understand that what she is doing is not simply lecturing. She is engaging in an act of interpretation. She is attempting to do something that many people would say is impossible, to articulate the inner workings, the philosophical underpinnings, the intellectual and emotional landscape of a man who is, by any measure, one of the most powerful and opaque figures in the modern world. And I want to pause on that word, opaque, because that's the first thing that strikes me about this entire endeavor. We live in an age of unprecedented access. We can know the thoughts of celebrities in real time. We can follow the daily routines of public figures. But when it comes to the man at the center of the world's most populous nation, one of the most consequential leaders of the 21st century, there is a carefully constructed distance. And what Professor Jiang is attempting to do, what makes this video so compelling and frankly so unusual, is to look not at the surface, not at the official statements, not at the staged appearances, but at the mind, at the interior, at the person behind the position. Now, I want to be clear about what I'm going to do here. I'm not going to summarize the video in a linear way. That's not the kind of commentary I'm interested in offering. What I want to do is sit with what she's saying, turn it over, examine the implications, and talk about what it means to even attempt such a thing. Because the act itself, the act of a professor, presumably in China, or connected to Chinese intellectual life, speaking about the mind of the sitting leader, is loaded with meaning. Every word is chosen. Every pause is significant. Every turn of phrase carries the weight of context, of history, of a political reality that most of us in the West can only dimly understand. So let's start with her voice. The way she speaks. It's measured. It's deliberate. There's a cadence to it that suggests she has thought about these words for a long time, that she is choosing them with care, not just for accuracy, but for safety. And I don't mean safety in the sense of physical fear, though I don't know enough to say whether that's a factor or not. I mean safety in the sense of responsibility. She is speaking about a man whose image is protected, whose legacy is being actively shaped, whose words and actions are scrutinized at every level. To speak about his mind is to enter a realm that is usually reserved for approved channels. So there's a tension in her voice, a tightness, a sense that she is walking a line. And yet what she says is not empty. It's not the hollow praise that you might expect from a state-affiliated academic. There is substance here. There is philosophy. There is history. She reaches back into Chinese intellectual tradition, into the teachings of Confucius, into the long arc of Chinese civilization, and she attempts to locate this man within that tradition, not as a departure from it, but as a continuation, as an embodiment. And that in itself is a profound claim. She talks about the concept of governance, not just as administration, but as moral cultivation. And this is where it becomes genuinely interesting to me, because it's such a different framework from the way we in the West typically think about leadership. In Western political thought, we tend to separate the person from the office. We don't ask whether a leader is wise in the same way we ask whether their policies are effective. We don't typically demand that a president be a moral exemplar in their private life, or at least we've become cynical enough to not expect it. But in the tradition she's drawing from, the character of the ruler is inseparable from the health of the state. The inner life of the leader is understood to ripple outward, to affect everything and everyone. So when she speaks about the mind of this man, she is not engaging in gossip or psychological speculation. She is, within this framework, speaking about the very foundation of national well-being. She talks about his reading, about the books he has studied, about the texts that have shaped his thinking. And this is where the video becomes, for me, unexpectedly moving, because she describes someone who is deeply immersed in the intellectual tradition, who has, according to her, spent decades engaging with the foundational texts of Chinese philosophy, of Marxist theory, of world literature. Whether or not you agree with his politics, there is something about the image of a leader who reads deeply, who studies, who takes seriously the intellectual inheritance of his civilization. In an age of sound bites and tweets, of leaders who seem to have no patience for complexity, there is something almost old-fashioned about this portrait, something that speaks to a different understanding of what leadership requires. But she doesn't stop there. she goes further. She talks about his relationship to the Chinese people. And here, her language becomes more careful, more layered. She speaks of a bond that is not just political, but almost familial. The concept of the leader as father, as guardian, as the one who carries the hopes and the burdens of the collective. And I have to admit, as someone who comes from a very individualistic culture, this language is both foreign and fascinating to me. We in the West are suspicious of that kind of paternalism. We've seen it abused too many times. We've built our political systems precisely to prevent any one person from having that kind of symbolic weight. But in the tradition she's describing, it's not about authoritarianism. Or at least, it's not only about authoritarianism. It's about responsibility, about the weight of carrying a civilization on your shoulders, about the loneliness of a position that no one can truly share. And she talks about that loneliness. This is perhaps the most unexpected part of the video. She speaks with what seems like genuine empathy about the isolation of supreme power, about how no one can truly be a peer to someone in that position, about how every interaction is mediated, every word is weighed, every gesture is interpreted. She describes a life of constant scrutiny, constant performance, constant vigilance, and she asks implicitly what that does to a person's mind, how it shapes them, how it changes them. Now I want to be careful here, because what she's doing is not criticism. It's not an exposé. It's something much more subtle. She is attempting to humanize a figure who is, by design, presented as larger than life. And in doing so, she is taking a risk, because to humanize is also to make vulnerable. To suggest that the leader has an inner life, with doubts and struggles and complexities, is to suggest that he is not simply a symbol, not simply an icon, but a person. And in systems where the leader is meant to embody the will of the nation, to admit to personhood is to admit to limitation, to imperfection, to humanity. She doesn't use those words. She doesn't say imperfection. But it's there, in the spaces between her sentences, in the way she pauses before certain words, in the way she chooses to emphasize his diligence, his discipline, his commitment, as if to say, these are the qualities that compensate for the weight. And I find myself wondering, is she speaking to us, the viewers? Or is she speaking to herself? Or is she speaking to some unseen audience, some set of listeners who need to hear these things said aloud, in a measured, academic voice, because they cannot be said anywhere else? This is the part that haunts me, honestly, because I don't know the conditions under which this video was made. I don't know if Professor Jiang is speaking freely, or if she is speaking within constraints. I don't know if her words are an act of genuine intellectual exploration, or a performance of loyalty, or something in between. And that ambiguity, that uncertainty, is itself a kind of commentary. It's a reminder that in certain places, the act of speaking about power is itself a political act, whether you intend it to be or not. And yet, even with that ambiguity, I found myself drawn in by her sincerity. There's a quality to her voice that feels genuine, not scripted, not hollow. She believes what she is saying, or at least she believes in the importance of saying it. She believes that understanding the mind of the leader is essential to understanding the nation, the people, the trajectory of history. And maybe she's right. Maybe in a system where so much power is concentrated in one person, the only way to truly understand the system is to understand the person. She talks about his vision, about the concept of the Chinese dream, and she doesn't treat it as a slogan, as many in the West do. She treats it as a philosophical project, an attempt to articulate a collective aspiration that is rooted in history, but reaching toward the future. She talks about what it means to restore national pride after a century of humiliation, about what it means to stand on the world stage not as a supplicant, but as an equal, as a leader in your own right. And whatever you think about the politics of it, you have to acknowledge the power of that narrative, the way it speaks to something deep in the human psyche, the desire for dignity, for recognition, for a place at the table. She also talks about his approach to governance, the emphasis on stability, on order. And here, she draws a contrast, not explicitly, but it's there in the subtext, with the chaos of the past, the Cultural Revolution, the famines, the periods of upheaval that scarred the national memory. She presents the current era as an attempt to learn from that trauma, to build a system that prioritizes predictability and control, because the alternative, in the collective memory, is too terrible to risk. And I think about that. I think about what it means to govern a nation of 1.4 billion people, with a history stretching back thousands of years, with wounds that are still healing, with ambitions that are global in scope. The sheer scale of it is almost unimaginable. And the idea that any one person's mind could encompass that, could hold it all, could make decisions that affect billions, it's almost absurd. And yet, that is the claim that is being made. Or at least, that is the assumption underlying this entire endeavor. That the mind of the leader matters. That it is worth trying to understand. That it is in some sense the key to understanding everything else. She speaks about his humility. And this is a moment where I felt a kind of cognitive dissonance, because the image we in the West have is not one of humility. But she describes a man who sees himself as a servant, as someone who has been called to a task larger than himself, who does not seek power for its own sake, but accepts it as a duty. Whether that is true or not, I can't say. But what I can say is that it's a powerful framing. It's the framing that every leader wants for themselves, across cultures and throughout history. The reluctant leader, the one who would rather be elsewhere, but who stays because the people need them. And maybe there's some truth in it. Maybe at that level of power, the ego that would seek it is exactly the ego that is least suited to wield it. Maybe the ones who end up in those positions are the ones who didn't want them, who were pushed by circumstance, by history, by forces beyond their control. Or maybe that's just a story we tell ourselves to make the concentration of power more palatable. I don't know. What I do know is that listening to Professor Jiang, I found myself doing something I didn't expect. I found myself trying to see past the politics, past the ideology, past the headlines and the sanctions and the territorial disputes. I found myself trying to see a person who wakes up in the morning, who reads, who thinks, who carries a weight that none of us can truly comprehend. And I found myself wondering, what would it be like to be him? To have that much responsibility? To know that every word you say will be passed by billions? To know that your decisions will shape the lives of generations not yet born? It's an impossible question. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the mind of someone in that position is fundamentally inaccessible to anyone outside it. Maybe Professor Jiang's project, however sincere, is doomed to fail, because there is no way to truly know what it is like to be that person. The loneliness she describes is not just a condition of the position, a wall that cannot be breached, no matter how much philosophy or history or empathy you bring to bear. But she tries anyway, and there's something noble in the attempt, something that speaks to the human desire to understand, to connect, to find the person behind the power, even when that person is deliberately, systematically obscured, even when understanding them requires navigating layers of symbolism and propaganda and fear, even when the attempt itself is fraught with risk. She ends the video, and I'm thinking about this now, trying to recall the exact words. She ends with something about hope, about the future, about the younger generation and the responsibility they carry to understand their history, their leaders, their place in the world. And her voice, which has been so measured throughout, becomes softer, almost tender. She talks about the importance of continuity, of passing something on, of not losing what has been built. And I find myself thinking about what she's not saying, about all the things that cannot be said, at least not in this forum, not in this way, about the silences that surround any discussion of power in a system where power is not supposed to be questioned, about the weight of those silences and what they do to a society, to a people, to the very possibility of honest conversation. But I also find myself thinking about what she is saying, about the attempt, however constrained, to engage seriously with the mind of a leader, to treat that mind as worthy of study, of understanding, of empathy even. And I wonder if that's not in some way a form of resistance. Not the kind of resistance that makes headlines, that gets people arrested, that challenges the system directly, but a quieter kind. A kind that insists on complexity in a world that demands simplicity, that insists on humanity in a world that reduces people to symbols, that insists on asking questions even when the answers are dangerous. I don't know. I'm still processing. This is one of those videos that stays with you, that sits in your chest, that makes you think about things you hadn't thought about before. It's not entertainment. It's not comfort. It's an invitation to sit with discomfort, with ambiguity, with the limits of your own understanding. And maybe that's the most important thing I can say about it. Not whether I agree or disagree, not whether Professor Jiang is right or wrong about the mind she's describing, but that she made me think, that she made me question my own assumptions, my own frameworks, my own ways of understanding power and leadership, and the relationship between the person and the position. That she made me realize how much I don't know, and how much of what I think I know is shaped by sources and perspectives that have their own agendas, their own blind spots, their own limitations. So I'm going to sit with that for a while. I'm going to let it settle. I'm going to think about the minds of leaders, all leaders, everywhere, about what we ask of them and what we allow them to become, about the loneliness of power and the dangers of that loneliness, about the people who try to understand, who try to translate, who try to build bridges between the inner world of the powerful and the outer world of the rest of us. And I'm going to be grateful, in a strange way, for having watched this. Not because it gave me answers, but because it gave me questions. Better questions. Harder questions. Questions that don't have easy answers, that might not have any answers at all, but that are worth asking anyway. Soft music returns. The same contemplative melody from the beginning. It swells gently, then begins to fade, leaving a long, quiet moment of silence before the sound of a deep breath, and then nothing.